Welcome to the We Talk Careers podcast, brought to you by Women in ETFs. This is Kristine Delano, and I'm thrilled you've joined us. If you're pursuing excellence in your own career or intrigued by the hustle required to make it to the top, this podcast is for you. This season, I'm joined by Nicole Gates, a seasoned leader and incredible friend. We're going to agree, challenge each other, and maybe spill some secrets. So put aside that massive to-do list and let's get inspired. We have a treat today because we have somebody who is sitting opposite me who is a master and can give a master class on our topic today. Today we are talking about managing tension. And whether she's known it her whole life or not, she is excellent at sitting in and thriving in tension that is just so healthful for teams, for families, for friendships. Just really intrigued about the conversation we're about to have. We are talking today about managing tension, this being a secret to our thriving organizations. I started thinking about this because, as many of you know, I am a board member of Women in ETFs, and I'm also acting governance chair. We often have conversations with chapter leaders and regional leaders where there is a great deal of tension in terms of budget versus opportunity, multiple people having great ideas coming to the table. And often when we come into these conversations, we pose it, frame it as a problem. And what I want to do today is flip the lid on that. These are not problems. In fact, they are a symptom of a thriving organization. By having these tensions and by defining them, understanding them, and then using them to add friction to our organizations, we evolve and grow in so many better ways than if we try to solve them. So today we're going to talk about managing tension. And like I said, I got the person sitting opposite me that is so good at this. So Nicole, and if you guys missed her bio in last episode drop, please go back to it. It is impressive. We are managing between high finance and federal contracting between the two of us. So we are bringing a rich experience here. But Nicole, tell me, what was your first impression when I said I wanted to do an episode on managing tension?
Well, first, I want to say thank you. I'm not sure I like to be introduced as a master in managing tension, but
you can't argue, can you? Can you argue?
No, really. My first impression is that you're totally right. It is absolutely necessary in terms of getting to a high-performing team. But there's also a part of it that is there's the unhealthy tension too, right? And I'm thinking back to those younger days. You know, I was in my early 20s, and it was a very, very male-dominated environment, and tool of the day was to scream. It was a lot of screaming and yelling and getting in people's face. And I was very uncomfortable with that. And so I would have this guy literally, 4 inches from my face, screaming and yelling, and my face would get red. I get tears in my eyes, and I would just kind of retreat back into myself. And I wasn't able to respond in a way that was effective. I wasn't balancing him in any way, and he got his way and walked away. After about a month or two of that, one of my coworkers came up, and it just happened to be that he was a Marine Corps fighter pilot. And he said, "Hey, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to deal with that guy." And he said, "You got to give it to him right back. You got to scream right back at him." And so, he suggested I do it. I couldn't do it. I just didn't come out. He said, "Practice with me." So I put my shoulders back, deep breath, practice with him, literally practice. And the next time that I'll call him the yelling coworker came and got in my face again, I did exactly that. Shoulders back, deep breath, screamed right back in his face. And he looked at me and he's like, "All right." And he walked away. And I was like, that's all it took.
Wow.
That's all it took to kind of draw the line. And for me, it was really a wake-up call as to how to deal with different dynamics in a room, some of which can be very aggressive or unhealthy. And then how do we turn that into healthy?
Right. And I think one of the things that you did really well is diagnosing that was an unhealthy tension, right? And that you didn't see then all tension as being unhealthy, which I think that is some of the things that are formed in us as children, is this idea of tension with our parents or tension with our siblings or our friends. We just want to live without it all. So we come into our jobs and we think, oh, this is something to solve. These are tensions that we want to go away. Your example is just so good because it basically says there are times where that kind of tension is a problem and we've got to solve it. And you did. You found a way. It might not have been what I would have, the advice I would have given you, but again, like really spot on advice that allows you to go forward and say, no more, I'm not taking it, versus the kind of tension that we're talking about that is something that thriving organizations must embrace.
Why do you think it is that it's such a misunderstood aspect of leadership?
One of the things that high-performing teams have figured out is that there is a space and time differential between the time in which a problem is discussed and when consensus is reached. When we artificially reduce the amount of time between those things and we get to consensus too fast, we do that for the sake of reducing tension, reducing friction, right? We don't want people to disagree. We want everyone to be on the same page. Get on the bus. We're all going in the same direction. Yeah. But by doing that, you're silencing people within the organization that may have something very valuable to say about the direction that we're going. And you're also silencing the ability to have like fruitful discussions that allow for future problems to be mitigated. I think that it's so important to embrace this tension and to understand how misunderstood it is, because we all need, at a certain point, everyone does need to get on the bus. Everyone does need to decide that we're going after this proposal and this is how much it's going to cost. But before that, we need a time of embracing everybody's views and understanding that some of that's going to feel uncomfortable.
Those are great points, Kristine. And I think that there's a normal tension, right? One that we're usually comfortable with: finance versus engineering and sales versus execution. I think the other tension that we don't always think about or be purposeful about are those that are group dynamic, right? So understanding that how men respond to tension might be different than culturally how women respond. Generationally, if you have Gen X or millennial versus maybe, a baby boomer or silent generation, I'll call it the geographical Boston versus South Carolina, right? That's going to be a very different tension that the Bostonian may say, hey, this is how I communicate. And the South Carolinian is like, well, that's not very polite, right? Or if you're doing international negotiations, what the Spaniards consider testing you, that the Japanese would absolutely be appalled by. And so there are cultural dimensions that you as a leader need to be attuned to and almost, I would say, prepare for, in terms of getting the right tension that's culturally respectful while also getting the negotiating outcome that you want.
I will mention that the gender differentials, we had a incredible podcast on December 17th, if people want to just bookmark that in their head to go back and listen to, which really talks about the different generations and what they need and how they're motivated and what are some of the tensions that they bring. I will say that these cultural differences that we are seeing now as our organizations become more and more global, become more and more important. I think about the pre-work that needs to be done. I had a project in Japan a few years ago, and the pre-work that I needed to do to understand the cadence and order of the types of questions that I could ask so that I did not insult my host going out there, and that I was interested in doing that work. I wanted tension in terms of allowing for people to not have to agree right away, but I certainly didn't want to go into the unhealthful tension of being unaware of the cultural differences that we were going into. If we can tease out the parts of the tension and reframe it into sort of a positive force rather than something we fear, what are some of the positive tensions that you see in your organization that you don't want to solve, that you want to make sure continue to be tensions?
It depends on what the topic is, but I always think, kind of as I alluded to up front, finance versus engineering, right? Because finance is going to want a team to meet a budget. They have a certain amount of resources that are available. Engineering is going to make a solution as good as they can make it up until the very bitter end, right? And so having that push-pull between the two, how much development, are we going to do versus what are the resources available? Let the two kind of give it a little bit of give and go. It's not totally, obvious at the start. And also sales versus execution. You're always going to have, how far can we push it as we sell something versus is it really executable, right? Even within a solutions team, if they're doing too well, you want to ask them what's wrong, right? How can we make it better? Never ever be afraid to ask those questions and say, how could this be made into a better solution, or what would make us fail? What are some unintended consequences of this particular decision?
I think about the tension that most of us feel in our jobs, no matter what it is, with the amount of time that we're spending in it, which is work-life balance. It's the idea of you cannot solve this tension, right? You can't just be like, okay, for the next month, I'm just going to go to all my kids' games, be there for all of their stuff at their school. And then for the next month, I'm just going to ignore my family altogether. Great. No tension. It just does not work. It is an ongoing tension. And people who approach work and life and trying to do it by basically thinking it's a problem to solve get extremely frustrated with how they're showing up in each one. But if every day you're saying, you know what? This is just a balancing act. It is a tension that I'm going to try to manage throughout the day to assure that I'm there if my kid has got a fever and needs to be picked up from school, and I'm there if I got to get this presentation and I'm the only one who can give it at work. Both of those are going to be things that you're going to have to manage throughout the day. It's not anything to solve, unfortunately.
So explain why solving a healthy tension can often create those bigger problems.
One example that I've thought a lot about is one of the large companies that I worked with. Compliance was extremely important. So we had people that were looking at all of the materials that we were putting out. They were reading everything, assuring that we weren't making promises that we couldn't make. If you can imagine, the financial markets are heavily regulated. So we had to have compliance people coming in and saying, you can't do this. An unhealthy way of thinking about tension and thinking that it's a problem to solve is by saying, no, I want to say this in my glossy. I want to say this in my video, and having a compliance that just says no. Having a compliance that says no, but no, you can't do that. But let's talk about the pieces that you can do. Let's talk about the things that are working on this page, and let's sort of lean in that direction. Or let's try to be creative about what is the notion and what is the thrust of what you're trying to say, and let's find another way of saying it. I was always really surprised that by actually talking to the teams at compliance, we came out with a lot smarter ways of talking about things, because they pushed us to be more creative, more assertive, more clear in what we were defining. And I think that was one example of using that tension to actually elevate the work that we were doing.
Oh, that's great insight.
Yeah.
I would add that another time I would kind of let tension lie or even grow is in when team members hold each other accountable in a respectful way. Now, notice I said in a respectful way, but the highest performing or the highest accountable teams always have team members that kind of hold each other accountable, right? They each know their roles and responsibilities. And if somebody doesn't do it, hey, you owe me this. I need to get it done by X time frame. I think that's a healthy tension, right? Where somebody knows that their team members are kind of, hey, you're part of this too. Now, when it starts to go awry is when that turns disrespectful. And how do you kind of track it, but yet encourage it, right?
Right. So talk a little bit more about how they can communicate effectively with these ongoing tensions. Like how can they be respectful to each other in a way that maybe causes the right amount of friction?
Well, I think the first thing is making sure that roles and responsibilities are clear, right? And that goals and outcomes are clear. So you as a leader need to make sure that that's all clear. And then everybody, how you get there, encourage them to get there through different ways. I would say purposefully create teams that include a curmudgeon or a naysayer and let them know that that's okay, that that's good, right? That you're doing it to get to a better outcome. Make sure that rules of the road are clear, that we're not going to be personal and we're not going to be passive aggressive. We're going to make sure that we use appropriate language. And I say, you as the leader set the tone and kind of the rules of the road. And then you make sure that everybody knows how they participate and that the goal or the outcome is clear. And then let them go. Empower them.
One of the things that I've recognized about myself is that I'm not really great at taking a moment and celebrating when I should, I'm always on to, well, what was the next thing I should do, right? Like I'm excited to do the next thing and I don't always take that pause. But I have noticed with teams that having celebrations where we are mentioning everybody's contribution. So for example, you've got some unhealthy tension and friction in a company that's always celebrating the success of their sales team without understanding all of the people that made that possible. So we're going in and we're going to celebrate the sales team because we've met our goals. But have we gone back and we look at design and we look at proposal and we look at the engineering teams that understood this. We look at the finance teams that put this information together and we call out and celebrate everybody's part. And I think when we don't do that, we create an unequal balance in the kind of tension that we're doing, where we're sort of highlighting one team. We're basically saying sales is what we're after. And ultimately we are. That is the finish line for getting the funding that we need into the organization. But how do we along the way also create those opportunities to celebrate?
That's a great point. And I think you're spot on when you start talking about, if we only recognize the sales teams without recognizing the other groups. And one little effective tool sometimes that I use is to publicly ask the sales team, please, give a shout out to somebody in the engineering team that really supported you, or somebody from the finance team who did your pricing, and to have those organizations publicly recognize. And now you start to break down the silos and the barriers.
Yes. So as we think about managing tensions in our organizations and recognizing that we aren't solving them, we don't want to solve them, they are actually this healthy friction that helps us grow. Some of the things that we need to do, and you just mentioned it, is to sort of monitor and assess how we're doing in it. Do we have enough people speaking up? Do we have enough people that are being celebrated? Do we have enough understanding of what everyone else is doing? And then you mentioned before about encouraging these open dialogue between teams and how important that communication is. Talk to us a little bit more about aligning the tensions to the organizational goals. How is it that recognizing some of these tensions can change the way that we think about our goals?
When we start out the beginning of a project or the beginning of a kind of a team dynamic, making sure that the outcome or the goal is clear. And I know I've said that so many times, but I believe it's having clarity on the goal is important, because then you can explain to everyone, as long as you get to that goal and you do it in a respectful manner, that's okay, right? And the way that we get there, you can take different routes, different ways, and you can build a bridge to make it more efficient. You can dig a tunnel to make it more efficient, and that's all set. And I want you guys to challenge each other, right, as you get there. But everybody has to know what the outcome is. And if they think that the outcome is different, that's where the tensions start to become unbalanced. So what's one piece of advice that you'd give to leaders who are feeling overwhelmed by that constant push and pull of tension?
I think that, and I mentioned it at the head of our episode, that you are very good at not only sitting in tension, but thriving in it. And I noticed it when we first met. So we first met out in California. We were getting trained up to do Teach for America. You asked me the most insightful, interesting questions that really made me think. And I hadn't always had friends that that were willing to kind of not only ask the questions, but like listen to the answers and like feed it back to me. And I was thinking, wow, this is uncomfortable, but it's also so good and so enriching. I think that not everybody grows up being able to sit and thrive in that kind of tension. A lot of people move back away, right? Instead of leaning in, they're leaning back. And instead of entering into conversations where not everyone agrees, they're like going and ordering the ice cream. Like it's just not the place they want to sit. And so I think back to what that advice your Marine fighter pilot gave, which was so good, which was the practice. It was the idea of not using only the times that you're in tension to try to get better at it, but create situations in low stakes times to practice being in tension. So what are some of the things that you can have a conversation with your husband or wife about? What are things that you can do with your friends that create a little bit of tension between you, and do it in sort of the safe environment and say, I want to get more comfortable with attention here, and I want to know how to show up better. So can you help me sort of practice my way through tension? And I just think it is an underserved and under-practiced measure of success that leaders have.
It is so funny that you say that, because I had a father who was a history teacher and used the Socratic method on the kids at the dinner table every single night. So we never even knew what his position point was. He would just like play devil's advocate from the other side of the coin. So perhaps I just grew up practicing it with him every night at the dinner table.
Yes, well, we will put a big thank you to him. And I remember meeting him and being, you had actually prepared me. And I just think that a lot of folks don't have that kind of background. And I think it is possible to grow in it and possible to recognize the value of it as well.
So can we talk about today's work environment? It's one thing to have healthy tension, and it's a little bit easier to build trust with teams that are co-located. They can have lunch together. They know a little bit about each other's families, and there's a person behind the other side of the table, right? What about in today's kind of hybrid work environment or remote work environment where you're on a Zoom call? You probably don't know this person very well. How do we facilitate creative and healthy tension with remote teams and geographically dispersed teams?
Well, I really should be asking you this question, but I would say that one really important thing is to not miss the social cues in the beginning of meetings. It's so simple, but it's the idea that you are welcoming somebody into a conversation before we get to the meat of what this meeting is about. And it's finding those just very brief conversations about maybe you have a shared interest, maybe there's a shared memory, maybe there's something about, recently for me, it was we had both sat through the same technology presentation, and I thought it was extremely funny the approach the sales guy took. And so started a meeting with let's just laugh a little bit about, like how he went about it. And I feel like really understanding that we cannot, as humans, become unhuman when we go remote, right? Like we really do need to find ways that we connect that allow us to thrive in these conversations. What about you?
To be honest with you, I find this an area that is a continual challenge because it's harder to build the trust. And I think it's hard to have a safe space to have creative tension and healthy tension when you don't build that. So I do things like if I'm doing a particularly difficult strategy, I will bring the teams together for a couple of days strategy session. I think, if it's tactical, you might want to ask a question, does anybody have any thoughts about what are some unintended consequences that can happen as a result of this? Your first response is usually going to be silence. So then, you could even tee it up a little bit. Oh, come on, somebody has to have an unintended consequence, or I'll just wait until it comes up. Sit there in silence for a second. And somebody usually will say, all right, I don't want to stay here anymore. And they'll think of something that's an unintended consequence, at which point the next person is going to say, well, this could occur too. Well, now we have the outcome that we want, which is taking a topic and making it better or figuring out what could be improved upon.
And I think what you just talked through too, which is the idea that there's pre-work to some of these meetings, right? Like we could do a whole session on that of we're not showing up without people knowing the roles that they have. I think that those times of being able to sit in silence and waiting for someone to actually speak into it are so powerful, as well as people understanding what their role is. So I do these a lot, call people ahead of a conversation that I know is going to be difficult and say, I just want you to know that I see you in this. Like I see you as a leader that brings a compassion to our customers, and you see it from a perspective that not everybody has. I need you to show up with that perspective at this meeting. And there's going to be times that I'm going to softball that to you, and I want you to do it, and not just expect that they're going to know why I valued them in the meeting. You know, so that pre-work I think is incredibly important for setting up tensions that may just remain under the water if you don't sort of expose them prior to going in.
No, yeah. And I would go back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is the purposeful creation of diverse teams, right? And I mean diversity in terms of diversity of thought, diversity in terms of approach, diversity in backgrounds.
Great.
And that takes time.
And, you know, I got to say that really tees us up for our next episode. So the next time we are together, we're going to talk about discomfort. We talk a lot about succeeding in our comfort zones, understanding our comfort zone, understanding our places of strength. But how can discomfort in what we do, how we approach things, how we're sitting slightly off balance, really engage our careers and our levels of success? So certainly stay tuned for our next conversation. Thanks again, Nicole. This was so great talking to you.
Kristine.
And thank you, our listeners, for spending your time with us. I hope this is not just information, but you let it be transformational in how you think about your career. I'm rooting for you. If you're an Apple user, I'd really appreciate it if you took a few seconds to leave a rating and a review. Your ratings and reviews tell Apple that this is a podcast worth listening to. And in turn, your reviews will help We Talk Careers get in front of more listeners looking to succeed, just like you. And while you're there, go ahead and hit that follow button, because there's going to be another brand new episode and you don't want to miss it. Until then, keep thriving. Thank you for listening.